Hello, my dear students. We are now looking at paper number 314, E by A. Right? And what is the poem we are going to talk about today? Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Of course, you know that American literature is an important part of English literature today. American literature, when we think of the writers, we think of poets, we think of novelists, we think of short story writers, we think of dramatists, and we think of critics, of course. Today, I'm going to talk about a very, very well-known poet, Emily Dickinson. She wrote in the 19th century. Her life is interesting to many of us who look at the biographical details of a poet before we begin reading her or his poems. It could be true of any kind of writing. But I'm talking about this poet who wrote poems, very interestingly, without any titles. Most of her poems are known by the first line of the poem, right? An interesting thing about Emily Dickinson is that she began with a regular childhood. She went to school. She was born into a reasonably well-off family. She went to school in the normal course of events. She struck friendships with males and females. She wrote long letters to them, some of which we still have, some of which are not found anymore. But of one thing she was very clear, my dear students, that she didn't want her poems to be published. Of course, the poems did circulate among her close friends. There were bundles of poems. And she wrote, my dear students, almost 2,000 poems, 1,800 poems. And most of the poems were published posthumously. An interesting aspect of most of her poems is also the kind of metaphor that she uses. You know metaphors. You know how metaphors are different from similes. You also know that you have to put in, as a reader, you have to put in a little bit of effort in order to understand a metaphor. So the poem that we are going to be looking at today is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Let me read the poem to you, my dear students. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of the gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then it's centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. The poem, you would notice, my dear students, also has a number, 479. I told you about the number of poems that she wrote. Well, this poem, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, may make us wonder as we read those lines. Was she writing it on the last day of her life? Did she know that death was now coming? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And then imagine, once death has come, what are they doing? They are going in the carriage. The carriage, maybe the funeral that she's thinking about, or maybe she's imagining that she's having a ride with death. So there are only two people in the carriage. Who were they? Well, death and the poet, the person to whom death has come. And there's somebody else. Remember John Donne talking about death. You're not scared of death because death has already come. So here there is somebody else in the carriage, and that is immortality. Because now that you're dead, you're not thinking about dying anymore. And where are they going? The carriage, in which the death and the poet are traveling, she takes us through the oft-trodden path. Her regular route, she takes us along that. There is sunshine, there is brightness as she goes along. But before that, my dear students, I want you to look at the verse, 4-lined stanza. And notice how she uses the dash, not the hyphen, the dash. What happens when you see a dash? If you're reading aloud, what happens? Every time you see the dash, you pause. So what do? Because I could not stop for death, and then you pause. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. And then there's a dash again. The carriage held but just ourselves. Dash again. And immortality. There must be a reason she's doing it. Because the kind of pauses that she wants us to use when we read her poetry is something specific. So let's go on to the second verse. Remember, my dear students, reading a poem aloud is very, very important to be able to appreciate a poem, right? So how are we going? Now there's no hurry. Now that death has come to me, she says there's no hurry. And therefore, we slowly drove. We knew no haste. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. The poet says, I believe in etiquette. When he's with me, when death is with me, because death came to me, I'm not going to worry about what work is left. I'm not going to worry about following my hobbies, whether it is work or leisure, whether it's work or fun or play. I have put all that aside. You know, the complete cessation of activity once one is dead. And therefore she says, we slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. I was kind. And she is giving death an anthropomorphic form. She's giving him a gender. She does not say death and it, but she calls it his. She's giving him a human gender, the male. So we slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So we are going in a carriage. So obviously we are passing some routes, some well-known routes for the poet possibly, and therefore We pass the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We pass the fields of gazing grain. We pass the setting sun. There is brightness when the children are at school. After all, it's afternoon. Children go to school in the daytime and the sun is shining brightly. Okay? And then gradually the sun is setting. So maybe from life towards death, from day towards night, from light towards darkness. And so she says, we passed the setting sun. Or, let me make it clearer, she says, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown. Once one is dead, once one is being taken to be buried, one is probably dressed in one's finery, and therefore she's talking about gossamer. But when she's talking about the softness of the dew and comparing it to gossamer, you can see how beautifully the metaphor comes across. We paused before a house. We are gradually going on. The school, the road that I'm familiar with, the dew-dropped fields, dew-covered fields. And then we move on. And then we come to a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. You know, the mounds. You have to think of where people have been buried, right? And therefore the mound is something like something a little raised on the ground. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling on the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. So you have to imagine, right? You have to imagine. So now, in the carriage with death, she is traveling. And now probably they've reached the graveyard. They've reached the end of their ride. The ride, remember, with death. Because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me, she says. Since then, centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. What happens when one is dead? She's moving on to a slightly philosophical, from the physical death. She's moving on to something beyond, because once we are dead, we are alive for eternity. Does that sound like an oxymoron? It is not, because almost all religions tell us, and Dickinson was born into a religious family, and therefore she says, even as they began the journey, it was quite obvious that they were moving towards eternity. Seemingly a simple poem, my dear students, but really not so simple, because she's talking about how when one is dead, how one is dead in this world, one wakes up to an eternal life. And therefore, even as you begin your journey of life, she reminds us, we all know that death is a truth, that one day or the other, life has to end. But with that ending of life, we move into forever. We move into permanence. We move into eternity. That's how this poem concludes. Read the poem again. Look at each line. Read it aloud so that the beauty of the poem, the sound of the poem sinks in. Happy reading and all the best, my dear students.